as we light our chalice flame today, as chalice flames are lit in our brother and sister congregations across the world, we will hear words from the Unitarian Universalist minister, Steve Stock. We light this chalice to celebrate the inherent worth and dignity of every person, to reaffirm the historic pledge of liberal religion to seek that justice which transcends mere legality and moves towards the resolution of true equality, and to share that love which is ultimately beyond even our cherished reason, that love which unites us. Welcome. Welcome to this meeting house today, physically closed but spiritually open to all in these strange and difficult times. This meeting house has been closed for exactly 6 months today. On the 13th of March, I wrote out to people to say that we were closing temporarily while we found out what was going to happen with the coronavirus. Temporarily. Perhaps 6 weeks was in my mind, not 6 months. It's astonishing. Now, here in the meeting house in Sevenoaks, we are looking to trial a limited reopening from next Sunday. But these recorded services will continue too. Even if we fill all the seats in the congregation next week, and there are far fewer seats than there usually are, there will be a need for those who cannot be here to experience worship, to have the opportunity to share in community. And we seek to provide that access to all. Now, the government announced this week a rule of 6. It comes into effect from tomorrow. It's around 6 people gathering in one place at a time and all the other rules around that. Now, away from the specificity of that, it's a reminder that there are so many uncertainties underlying the situation we are in. And it's a nudge to ensure we recognise that sacrifices might still be made, need to be made by us ourselves in personal comfort, to ensure the wider safety of the vulnerable and those at greater risk. This balance of individual wants and collective needs is something that we find troubling and uncomfortable to deal with sometimes. Recognising our own circle is not necessarily the be-all and end-all of the world and where comfort is required. And this has been a challenge for people for hundreds and thousands of years. It is not new. So building on this new focus of 6, our service today looks at how we as Unitarians can keep the necessary balance in our lives and in the world in which we play such a part. This time is yours to reflect, to take time away, to look into your deeper self. This time and this space is yours. Welcome. Our first reading today is by the Reverend Kathleen McTigue, and this is from her collection Shine and Shadow, and is a piece Mending the Broken World. And I'm grateful to Kathleen for her permission to read this today. In early September, I stopped to watch my neighbour at work, repairing a stone wall that lines the road perpendicular to ours. Built as all the old walls in our region have been, the stones are held by balance and judicious choice, rather than by mortar. The wall was built well, but the weight of many decades has broken it here and there, with some stones fallen out of place or carried away for some other use. As I warm myself in the autumn sun and watch him work, I see that about half of what he does is simply look at the stones in their haphazard pile, stroking his chin in thought. Then, from time to time, he rolls one from the pile onto the ground and turns it from side to side, pondering, or walks back to study again the place in the wall he's trying to mend. When he finally makes his choice, he's sure. Each stone wall, or each stone waits for the right opening, the place where its perpendicular heft and shape fit as though cradled. Once in place, it is no longer merely a stone, but an essential part of the wall. Part of a larger thing, taking shape as naturally as a tree flows from root to trunk to branch. Now, my neighbour is an ordinary working man. I know his name, and sometimes we talk together about life and horses and his willingness to help me haul manure from my garden one of these days before the first hard frost. But on this sunny September afternoon, as I watch his eyes and hands become familiar with each stone and then lift it to shape the wall, it's easy to imagine God at work in the immense universe, quietly humming, pulling our lives together into something strong and useful. I don't mean we're mute or helpless, waiting passively for the great stonemason to lift and move our lives or tell us where we belong. I mean only that there is a place for us, that our gifts, the shape of our minds and our talents, the angles of our interests and our concerns, fit the needs of the world the way my neighbour's stones anchor themselves in the lengthening wall. I mean that the world's possibilities shift and change each time we put ourselves into building something large and strong and beautiful. Whether or not we find room in our theologies for the word God, the world calls us to imagine ourselves essential to this engaged holiness, bringing forth what is ours to give of creation and strength toward mending this broken world. The words of Kathleen McTigue. Let us join together in a time of prayer. Great Spirit of life, within our hearts and moving among the stars, we approach with powers and capacities within. We call on the Spirit as we seek truth. We call on the Spirit by following our conscience rather than our passions. We bring the Spirit when we receive a blessing gratefully, bear a trial patiently, or encounter peril with courage. Whenever we perform an unselfish deed or lift our hearts in true adoration. We live the Spirit whenever we resist the habits and desires that are in conflict with our higher principles, whenever we speak or act with moral urgency or devotion to duty. May the divine grow within us and our spiritual hopes blend seamlessly with the life we lead. Eternal Spirit, Mother, Father, ever present if only we have eyes to see. We stand in awe in the presence of the universe. In its proper time may the mystery unfurl before us. Though fettered by our material desires, may the depths of the Spirit uphold and guide us. May the great gifts of the earth sustain us. May the universe forgive our faults and our follies, and may we in equal measure be forgiving. May we ever turn our eyes toward the light, to dispel the darkness which would engulf us. We give thanks for the bounty of the universe, which abounds with power and glory beyond our greatest imaginings. If you wish to, I welcome you to join with me in the words of the last prayer, following the words in bold on the screen. Eternal Spirit, may we be led from death to life, from falsehood to truth. May we be led from despair to hope, from fear to trust. May we be led from hate to love, from war to peace. Let peace fill our hearts, our world, our universe. Amen. Our second reading is a biblical story of sorts. It's a radical retelling of a story I'm sure most of you, if not all of you, will know. But it's a telling that challenges and provokes shock, deliberately so. Now the original was in chapter 6. Chapter 6, funny that, was in chapter 6 of John, the Gospel of John, and elsewhere in the Bible. It features quite a lot. But this is not the original. This is Jesus and the 5,000, a first world translation by the radical Christian philosopher and organiser Peter Rollins. Now, it comes from his collection of stories, The Orthodox Heretic, which takes well-known biblical passages and other types of Christian story and retells them in a way that challenge, provoke, and really do make you think. This is Jesus and the 5,000. Jesus withdrew privately by boat to a solitary place, but the crowds continued to follow him. Evening was now approaching, and the people, many of whom who had travelled a great distance, were growing hungry. Seeing this, Jesus sent his disciples out to gather food, but all they could find were 5 loaves of bread and 2 fishes. Then Jesus asked that they go out again and gather up the provisions that the crowds had brought to sustain them in their travels. Once this was accomplished, a vast mountain of fish and bread stood before Jesus. Upon seeing this, he directed the people to sit down on the grass. Standing before the food and looking up to heaven, he gave thanks to God, and he broke the bread. Then he passed the food among his 12 disciples. Jesus and his friends ate like kings, in full view of the starving people. But what was truly amazing was that the miraculous piece about this meal was that when they had finished the massive banquet, there was not even enough crumbs left to fill a starving person's hand. a challenging take on Jesus and the 5,000, from Peter Rollins. Our hymn today, with words by the Reverend Cliff Reed, draws on the theme of togetherness. Remembering Kathleen McTigue's reflection on the strength of individuals joining together, this is "Together now we join as one." For those with a purple book, it's number 178. For the rest of us, the words will be on the screen. Together now we join as one. We've heard this week of a new twist in the bewildering turn of policies and approaches to the coronavirus. The Prime Minister has announced the importance and underlying strength of a rule of 6. Now, 6 is an interesting number. In mathematical terms, it's a perfect number, which means if you add up the numbers it is divisible by, they will equal 6. There aren't many numbers that work in that way. 28's the next one, and the next one's in the 8,000s. So it's a perfect number, which is quite rare in mathematics. But it's an interesting number nonetheless. 5 and 7 are great from a religious perspective, 6 not so much. But in my youth, I was fascinated by a rerun of a television programme from the late 1960s. And it was from the Lou Grade stable. And it was the tale of a former spy who's decided to escape his job. On the cusp of leaving, he's gassed in his house and knocked out, and on waking, finds himself in a place that is known only as the village. And the series follows various attempts by this now prisoner to escape the village, all to no avail. Now, the prisoner, created and acted by Patrick Magoon, did not have a name in the village. No one did. They were all equal. They knew nothing of each other's backgrounds. They were numbers. And he was, as I'm sure many of you will remember, number 6. Now, as with many TV shows, particularly some of the more creative ones from the radical end of the 1960s, there was a subtext to The Prisoner. It was a challenge to the ideas of individualism and collectivism, and perhaps looking at the dangers of moving too far towards one or the other, where balance is usually required. The new rules of number 6, perhaps. Now, for Unitarians, we live in constant flux around the importance of individualism and collectivism. From an individualistic perspective, we believe in the inalienable right of all to have their own ideas, of free speech, of non-dogmatic and non-creedal approach to faith and belief. Now, Ellen Meeksins Wood, the historian and scholar, when writing about the concept of socialist and liberal individualism, referred to the right of the individual to freedom and self-realization. Now, this is surely something we support as Unitarians, the long-held reference to the inherent worth and dignity of all people, of the call for respect and the respect of others. That right of the individual to freedom and self-realization. Now, to quote Patrick McGoon's Prisoner, "I am not a number, I am a free man." And without an understanding of our individuality, of our needs, our desires, our frustrations, our hopes, our dreams, our loves, we can never fully expect to fully understand the role we might play in this world. Now, however, of course, individualism has potential faults. The prioritization of the individual, the pandering to individual demands, the attempted dominance that this can lead to, if unchecked, begins to interfere with the values of community and cohesion we hold so dear. So, contrasting, or perhaps complementing this key principle of the inherent worth and dignity of the individual, are the further principles of a world community where all are able to enjoy peace, liberty and justice. All. And the integral recognition of the interdependent web of existence of which we are all part. So there's an element of collectivism there as well, recognising we're part of this bigger thing and we need to work together. Now, Max Weber, the early 19th century sociologist, looked at individualism and collectivism through the prism of Christianity. He saw Protestant individualism and he saw Catholic collectivism. Poles apart, yet all a bit of the same continuum. Protestants were thinking for themselves. The Protestants had an individual ethic underneath them, whereas the Catholic Church was looking at community and was looking at working together to create something different. It's very, very stark. It's very, very stereotypical in its approach. But that was Weber's immediate reaction. And this was an idea continued by Geert Hofstede, the social psychologist who died earlier this year, who looked at society at its widest and saw a need for both individualism and collectivism if society is to be properly balanced. A culturally diverse society in many forms was where Hofstede believed progress and stability could coexist. Now, this complementarity of individualism and collectivism is highlighted well in our first reading. Kathleen McTigue spoke of her neighbour, the stonemason, the wall builder. His skill, no doubt grown and settled over many years, is to recognise the individual and unique strengths of each and every stone being collected for the dry stone wall. No two stones are the same, yet the guiding expertise of the neighbour allows each individual stone to play its part in building the collective defence for the edge of the field, for cattle, for crops, for safety. Strong and stable, alone and together, the two forms are utterly reliant on each other for continued purpose and worth. The stone on its own, well, it's a stone. The wall without stones, well, it's not even a wall. However, by bringing the individual stone together with others, the wall builder is able to provide a collective success, each element retaining a sense of individuality, yet working successfully to a stronger conclusion. Now, the problem in all this comes when we can become blinded to the true needs of the collective. When we ourselves, as individuals, begin to identify and shape what we believe will be the needs of the collective. Now, our second reading of Jesus and the 5,000 was a great mind game on how we manage the world in which we live. Peter Rollins titles this as a first world translation, and I'm not keen on the notions of first and third world, but for the purpose of this reading, there is a logic in retaining that title. Now, as I'm sure many of you will be aware, the original story, one that unusually features in all four Gospels, is that the story that Jesus arrives with a great crowd, and having gathered 5 loaves and 2 fishes from a boy in the crowd, apparently the only person with any food, Jesus thanks God and starts to share. And all 5,000 are fed, and there are 12 baskets of leftovers. Now, it's a challenging miracle story, and there are many possible interpretations. They range from the idea that God and/or Jesus created the additional food from nothing, to a more pragmatic idea that says the crowd were inspired by the idea of sharing, and they unpacked their hidden lunches they'd intended to keep to themselves. This latter interpretation talks, of course, of the need for the collective to unpick the individualist's caution that protects the self. Now, Peter Rollins' rewrite, of course, takes us on a different path entirely. Having managed to gather the food of all those assembled, so we do have the wherewithal to feed everyone, Jesus and his disciples tuck in and finish the lot without sharing or recognising the needs of the many. It's a stark story, it's deliberately provocative, but in its absurdity lies its value. Jesus and the disciples, the leaders and those that supposedly preach inclusion and compassion, they are the ones that sit down and eat the feast to completion. Looking at their individual needs, they are now satisfied. Looking at their limited collective needs, that of the group of disciples, they've also acted compassionately, and they're all fine. They raised sufficient for their friends, they shared what they had taken. Collectively, the disciples had moved beyond their individualism to support the wider group. Except, of course, they hadn't. They had self-defined a collective, a society they felt comfortable with. They drew the boundary around themselves. Now, in Kathleen McTigue's story, neither the stone nor the wall determine the way the wall is constructed. Okay, they're inanimate objects, but the underlying intent is clear. Kathleen refers to the need for the stonemason to determine how the individual and the collective can be built at full strength. Now, turning that story to wider society, Kathleen then talks of the potential for God to help pull our individual lives into a collective purpose. Not for an individual to do it, not for a small group to do it, but for God to do it, to fashion coherence from our differences, yet retain our individual selves. Of course, and as Kathleen acknowledges, the idea of an external God shaping us does not work for many Unitarians. However, if we take this idea of God, of being the all that is, it becomes possible to stress the need to listen to the all that is, to allow the needs of the wider world to shape our individual responses, to allow the needs, the collective needs, to shape our responses, rather than expect us to do it ourselves. Not to look at the small circle of privilege around us, but listen to those wider needs, perhaps of those we don't usually hear. Now, in this time of COVID, and the uncertainty over how things will morph and evolve in the coming weeks, this sense of accepting our individual input to the collective may not take us to a comfortable place. It may take us to a place that is both a challenge and a practical example of how we might start to consider our lives to be shaped by something else. Yet we are not numbers. We are not number 6, as Patrick Magoon was in The Prisoner. Yet we're not completely free either. The rule of 6 shows us that. Now, working to step away from an approach to the world that simply favours our friends and those like us is the trap that Peter Rollins warns us of. The original story, the gospel version, inspires us instead to look at the needs of those we don't know, of those we've never met. We do not control the collective need. It's the composite requirement of a greater number of individuals than we can ever imagine. Yet we can contribute to it if we allow ourselves to be open to the all that is, to listen, to understand, to respond. As Unitarians, we can find our place between the two poles of that continuum. We are all individuals searching for the better, all-inclusive, collective community. Let us come now to a time of stillness and silence. As we settle our bodies, perhaps closing our eyes, focusing on our breath. I shall speak some words and then strike the singing bowl. Then we shall come together in stillness and quiet together. As we settle our bodies, turning our thoughts inside. With words by the Irish poet W.B. Yeats. Though leaves are many, the root is one. though leaves are many. The root is one. Spirit of life, we give thanks for your presence, for light and for love, for night and for change. Our worship is over, but our service continues. As we depart from this space, may there be peace among us, now and forever.